Hello, Jan here from Forest Bathing Nature Tonic, and today I'm going to talk about moss. So I found a piece of tree that's fallen down that was covered in moss as it was sitting up there in the canopy, and I've been learning about moss and learning how amazing it is, and we can learn so much from it. It's called a primitive plant, and yet actually I think it's incredibly well adapted. It's so clever, and I'm going to tell you some of the reasons that I've been discovering that make it one of the great survivors. And I have loved moss since childhood. I grew up in an area where we have stone walls around the fields, and they are very often covered in moss, and since childhood I have loved to touch moss. It feels cool and refreshing, it's soft, and at the moment it's very juicy. But that's not always the case. When we're in a drought and we haven't had much rain and the air becomes dry, the moss dries out and becomes almost leathery. It looks dead. You touch it and it feels crispy, and you can even hear it as you stroke it. I'll try and find some old footage from last spring when we had a drought. And then I know from experience and from my childhood that within hours of the rain, the moss just springs to life. It's like the phoenix arriving from the ashes, and it goes from this crunchy, leathery, dead, sorry-looking, droopy stuff to this soft, juicy, deliciously cool and refreshing plant. And I've been learning how amazing that is as a mechanism. So, it turns out that moss does not have a circulation system. We, as humans, have a blood system and a lymph system. Trees have xylem and phloem. They have channels where the sap flows within them, up the trunk and through the leaves. Moss does not have a circulation system. Most of the plant material in moss is one cell thick. It's just a little thin film of flesh, if you like, with no veins going through it. And what I once took to be the roots, there are some brown, I'll show you later, some brown fibres that anchor the moss to whatever it's living on. They're not roots. That's just an anchor. The moss takes nothing from below, not water or nutrients. It absorbs all of its water through its leaves, through this filmy, very, very delicate and yet very strong leaf material above. And so it does not control how much water is contained within it. We have a mechanism. If we're too hot, we sweat. If we're too dry, we close down our sweat. We produce less urine. We control how much water is in our bodies. Trees that have vascular systems, water systems, they do the same thing. They have little pores on their leaves that can open to transpire, and they can close them up if they're lacking in water. They even droop to give off less water. Mosses don't do that. They just go with the flow. When there's plenty of water, it's moist and juicy. When there's a drought, they just dry out. They go, oh, things are not looking good. I'm going to allow myself to desiccate, and they can lose up to 98% of their water content. And then when the times are good again, when it rains or there is mist or fog, and the leaves, this thin film of flesh, can absorb the water again, they just bounce back and there's no tissue damage. How amazing is that? And this can go on for a long time. Last spring we had the drought that lasted week upon week upon week. I was watering my garden like mad. The mosses hung in there for a couple of months, and then within hours of the rain coming, they were back to where they were. I've heard that some mosses can live for years. There are some mosses that live in deserts that can live for decades. And I've even heard, I don't know how true it is, that they found some moss in a drawer in a museum that they knew was over 40 years old. They sprayed it with water and it came to life. What an amazing, amazing creature this is. So just imagine what it would be like if we as people could do that. If as humans we could see that there was a drought coming, there was going to be a food shortage, certainly a water shortage, we could just put ourselves in boxes so we weren't eaten by rats or something, completely desiccate, become mummies, and just wait until the conditions were right. And then the person who was left in charge could come round and sprinkle water on us, and we could bounce back and get on with our lives again. That's what moss does. And I have always loved moss. I feel very tender towards it, just partly because of my childhood memories, partly because it feels so delicious. There's so much that we can learn from this, what is called a primitive plant. It's called a humble primitive plant because it's not as advanced. It hasn't got flowers, it hasn't got a water system. And yet, actually, I think it's extremely advanced. It's extremely resilient and adapted to life on Earth. And I'm just full of admiration for it. That's not the half of it. I'm going to tell you more in other videos. This is just about its water abilities. Now, the more I've read about moss and the more I've learnt about it, I'm seeing it everywhere. And if you're in the Northern Hemisphere, this is a great time of year to look out for it because a lot of the leaves are off the trees, we haven't got the herb plants on the ground, and the moss is very, very apparent. So I've been going for moss walks when I just look at moss, and I'm amazed. It's everywhere. And it's beautiful. So I invite you to go out and find some moss and touch it and explore it. And if you don't know already, discover how delicious it is and what a lovely experience it is to touch it. See you next time. Bye-bye.